Well, I like Rick's idea of giving a definition to start out with, so I think we'll start that way with this particular attitude. And I didn't have this in the notes, but let me just give you a couple of English definitions after I go through this chart. So these are our foundation principles, and I'm not going to read through all of them. I think we're familiar with them. And just keep number 4 in mind. We'll come across a passage here that one might apply to. But here are our examples of jealousy, and so that's the first section on your lesson sheet. But like I said, what I'd like to do is go through what a definition of jealousy is. Anybody want to take a stab at it? What do you think of when you think of jealousy? Pardon me, say that again. Okay, wanting what somebody else has. All right, that's good. Envious, which is similar to that. Okay, those are good. And so notice here, and of course this doesn't show up as well, and I can't read that, so I'm going to have to turn around. So jealousy, it says, a jealous disposition, attitude, or feeling. Don't you love it when the word you're trying to define is used in the definition? So jealousy is being jealous, according to number 1 there. And the second one is zealous vigilance. Now that's interesting. So notice those two. I think number 1 we're more familiar with, but number 2 says zealous vigilance. Okay, so let's look at jealous. And I just blacked out my screen there. So let's look at jealous. And jealous is, get my pointer, hostile toward a rival or one believed to enjoy an advantage, an envious. So that's kind of the idea that was expressed here about envy. So you might have a rival, somebody else that's competing with you. Maybe they have something, and so you become jealous of what they have or some advantage. Notice the second one here talks about intolerant. And again, it mentions rivalry, and here it adds unfaithfulness. So far on the negative side, wouldn't you say? Intolerant or envious. And then the second part of that second definition says disposed to suspect rivalry or unfaithfulness. So again, it's kind of that negative attitude about that. And then look at number 3, which is like the second one in our first definition, vigilant in guarding a possession. Vigilance in guarding something. Okay, so that's how we use the word. Let's go back to the Greek language and just notice how some of these definitions are given based on verses in which they're used. And I want you to notice the Greek word from which this is translated. And there may be others, but this is the only one I've found. I'm suspecting that this is the only one, okay? The Greek word is, and that second letter is like a long A, zelos. And we get what word from that? Zeal, okay? Interesting, isn't it? So I said it sounds like, looks like our word zeal. And of course, it's translated that way on some occasions. But on some occasions, it's translated with our English word jealous. So notice this particular source has these 3 definitions concerning the use of the word jealous in the Bible, and this is the New Testament. So the first one here is earnest concern, deeply devoted zeal. Okay? A couple of passages where this is found and used this way. And notice that it's actually translated zeal. Verse 2 of Romans 10, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And then down in 2 Corinthians 7, verse 7, this is the second passage, and this is Paul. You know, we studied recently that Paul was waiting for Titus to come and give him word about the Corinthians. And so he finally runs into Titus while he's in Macedonia before he goes down to Corinth. And he says that Titus brings this report and says, not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you. So he's been comforted by Titus, and Titus has been comforted by the Corinthians, as he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice still more. So, in that second passage, it's translated zeal in this particular translation, but this is the same word from which we get jealous. Now, look at the second definition here. Oh, I had them here. I put these slides together, and then I don't have any way of knowing what's coming. So, okay. So now you can see that. All right? Your zeal for me. So, second definition, jealousy, envy, resentment. So let's go to Acts 13:45, and we'll be looking at a similar one to this, but this definition had that passage. But when the Jews saw the crowds, this is in Antioch of Pisidia, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. Okay, so that's interesting. Paul goes to the synagogue, he preaches, and they say, come back next week. Well, he comes back the next week, and the whole town's there. And so the Jews become jealous to the extent that they do what? What's their action as far as their jealousy here? All right, contradict what was spoken. I don't know, were they just trying to disprove him? Were they just trying to contradict him? But notice, reviling him. That word revile is what we studied last week, ridiculing him. Okay, so when you can't beat somebody, what do? You start to ridicule them. And that's what they do to Paul. But all of this is caused by their jealousy. They're envious of the crowds that Paul is attracting with a message that's going to include Gentiles as well as Jews. And so these Jews don't like that. All right, one other one. Extremely, intensely, fierce, or raging. So it's the same word, same Greek word. Notice how it's used in Hebrews 10:27. So we're trying to get an idea of how this word is used to give us a definition. Hebrews 10:27, but a fearful expectation of judgment. So we're in the middle of a sentence. And a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Now, we don't have jealousy or zeal in this verse, but that word zelos is used to translate one of these words. Any guess as to what that word is? Which word there might? Okay, fury, exactly right. Fury of fire. And if you add the verse before it, verse 26, you might recognize this. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but, okay, what can you expect? A fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire, a jealousy of fire, a zeal of fire that will consume the adversary. So that's kind of interesting, and we may come back to that as far as that idea, a fury of fire. So, among other points, it's simply to say there's a word that we would recognize and kind of relate to zeal, but it can be used in some different ways. Maybe a positive way, maybe a negative way. Now, another form of this word is used, can you remember someone that was with Jesus that had something to do with zeal? Simon the Zealot. What was a zealot? Usually you see that as a capital Z. And I'm not asking you, okay, what is that particular sect, but what do you suppose they were about? A zealot in Jerusalem, we got somebody at the door. Okay, a zealot in Jerusalem would probably be doing what as far as Roman occupation, etc.? Yeah, he would be opposed to the Romans and he would be for the Jews. And the Jews don't like the Romans. So the Zealots were trying to undo the Roman occupation. And, if you think about that, we're really talking about what we would call patriotism. Okay? Somebody who's really zealous in a nationalistic way. So you can see how zeal fits into that picture as well. Okay? So all those things have to do with this word from which we translate our word jealous. Okay, now with that in the background, let's look at these examples, and what you were supposed to do in each case was to say what's the cause of jealousy, and then is this something that God would approve of? Well, let's look at each of these, and I don't have the passages up here. If you want to turn to them in your Bible, you may. Acts chapter 5 is similar to Acts 13, and we're going to look at Acts 17 in just a moment. All right, Acts 5 and 12, this is early in Jerusalem where the apostles are working. And notice what verse 12 says. Now many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles. Well, what does that cause in Jerusalem if you read the verses that follow? What do you suppose it would cause? They're doing miracles. Okay, persecution, what was the first one? Jealousy. Okay, jealousy and persecution, right. You're exactly right. The people actually react by doing what? Verse 13, it says, none of the rest dared join them, but the people held them in high esteem. More than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, so that they even carried out the sick into the streets. It's like people are flocking to them, and it's a lot reminiscent of what Jesus did during his ministry. Well, how do you suppose the authorities respond? They're jealous. Look at verse 17. But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, and we won't go into the rest of the story, what they basically do is arrest the apostles. They don't like this attraction that they're causing by working these miracles and believers being made, and so they become jealous. Getting my J and my Z mixed up here. Okay, so the cause is what? What causes the jealousy? Yeah, the crowds that are being attracted to Peter and James and others working miracles. Was the jealousy of the Sadducees approved of God? I think we'd have to say no, wouldn't we? I mean, the text doesn't tell us, but we can only guess that they arrest the apostles and they charge them. On this occasion, they beat them and they say, no more preaching, and the apostles ignore it. Okay, let's look at the second example, somewhat similar to this first one. Acts 17. Paul is in Thessalonica, and he goes to the synagogue. That was his custom. And for 3 Sabbath days, verse 2, Acts 17, it says, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. So he's telling the Jews in their own place, the synagogue, that this has now been fulfilled, that Jesus is this Christ. The very one that was put to death was raised from the dead. And that probably was a shock to some of them. Well, what happens in verse 4? It says, some were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But look at verse 5. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason. So the cause of this jealousy, again, is what? Paul's preaching, isn't it? He's teaching, people are being converted by hearing the truth. The Jews don't like it. And so they hire a mob to try to cause an uproar, and they do. And they try to take Jason. Apparently, Paul wasn't available. Would this have been approved of God? No. Wrong kind of jealousy here, isn't it? Okay, let's go back to the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 37. We all know this story. And verses 5 to 11 tell us about the dreams that Joseph has, where he sees his brothers bowing down to him. And whether it's the sheaves out in the field or the stars that are bowing down, he tells his father and his brothers, verse 10. And what do they make of that? Yeah, if you had a dream and you said to your family, you're all bowing down to me. They're probably not going to be real eager about that, whether that's going to happen. And verse 11 says, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Okay, we know what happens next, verses 17 down to verse 24. They take some action against Joseph. Verse 18, they conspire against him to kill him. And it's only because of, is it Reuben, that kind of dissuades them from actually putting him to death. But they put him in a pit, and they determine they're going to lie to their father. And so they take this coat of many colors, robe of many colors, and they take it back to him and say that a wild animal has gotten him. Okay, so obviously the cause of the jealousy is what? Okay. Yeah, so it's really Jacob who shows his favoritism toward Joseph that causes some of this animosity, but the brothers don't react in a positive way, in a good way, and certainly their actions are not approved of God. Why, they're ready to put Joseph to death. Okay, so okay. Right. Okay, so okay. So Sandy is asking, does this indicate an insecurity on their part? And I guess we would have to say, sure, they're insecure. They don't feel that they have the same status as their brother does, and that can often be the case, that insecurity would cause that. Okay? Anybody want to add to that? Any thoughts? Yeah. Jacob starts it. He's showing that this one son is the favorite. I mean, you got 12 sons and one's got this special robe. So that kind of stands out, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. All right. All right, let's go on. Now, these may be not as familiar, and this one in Numbers 5 is interesting. It's a, I suppose it's kind of a ritual or a command. If an Israelite husband suspects that his wife might have been unfaithful, and I'm not going to go read through the entire thing. Maybe you've done that. I hope you have. If not, you can read through that. But there's kind of this elaborate ritual, I'll call it for lack of a better term, where the priest has the woman do certain things, and it's used to determine whether or not she has been unfaithful. Now, it's interesting in part because, we don't ever read that I know of this actually being practiced. Was it? I don't know. It almost seems like it's got sort of a providential, almost kind of a miraculous ability to determine whether someone's been unfaithful. But look down at verse 31. Actually, verse 29. Let's read 29 to 31. This is the law in cases of jealousy when a wife, though under her husband's authority, goes astray and defiles herself. So that seems to be, okay, the situation in which she has been unfaithful, or when the spirit of jealousy comes over a man and he is jealous of his wife, then he shall set the woman before the Lord, and the priest shall carry out for her all this law. And notice verse 31, the man shall be free from iniquity, but the woman shall bear her iniquity. So what do you think verse 31 is indicating? The cause would be whether or not the wife's been faithful. Do you think this is approved of God? Pardon me? Okay, not her behavior, certainly if she's unfaithful. Okay. Now, it may be that he suspects that and she hasn't been unfaithful. Okay. Verse 31 seems to indicate that he's free from iniquity. And again, we're not given all sorts of qualifications as to how this might work. But let's just kind of think about that one. And so I said approved of God. Verse 31 is approved of God. You know, lots of questions arise about, like I say, how often was this practiced? In terms of, you know, the husband's attitude, etc. But let's just keep that kind of on the back burner, and we'll maybe come back to that idea, that concept. Okay, let's go to Romans 10 and 11, and we've got some statements made. Paul argues in this section, so this is pretty involved section in Romans where he's talking about what happens to the Jews. If God gave the gospel for them and they reject it, what's going to happen to them? Well, part of the answer is this, verse 19. Paul asked, verse 19, but I asked, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, and notice what Moses said, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation, I will make you angry. Kind of interesting there that jealous and angry are sort of parallel thoughts there. But it seems to be that Moses is saying on God's behalf that because of their rejection, I'm going to make you jealous. And then Isaiah says, verse 20, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. So the end result is others sought after the gospel, and I think primarily the Gentiles, because of Israel's obstinance and stubbornness. Now, look at verse chapter 11, and this thought continues later. The word jealous is used again. Verse 11, so I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. And then drop down to verse 13. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So Paul's using the term jealous. He's quoting from the Old Testament. Our question is, well, I guess we answered the first part. You know, the Gentile salvation is going to cause this jealousy. Is this approved of God? What would you say? Okay, prompts the Jews to return to him. Was it, yeah, Ian, go ahead. Okay. 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 So, yeah, Sandy, go ahead. Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. All right. And what was the original state of the Jews as far as God was concerned? Did they have a relationship with him? They were his nation, okay? Now, they misunderstood that, obviously, especially when the gospel came, but they had a special relationship with God, and they kind of lost that, and others are entering into a new relationship, which is really the one God intended. But you can see how that works. They possess something that they lost, and now they want at least something back, Was it always the right attitude or not? Not necessarily. Okay, so I think we can say in this case, I would say that, yeah, this is approved of God because Isaiah says that's what God intended. I'm going to make my people jealous. In the sense that he wants them to realize what it is they've lost and what others have enjoyed, and he wants them to see that. Okay? And that seems to be the design of this. So I know we've still got some questions here, so let's just hang on to that. We'll think about this in terms of all these examples. All right, 2 Corinthians 11, 1-3. Listen to what Paul says. I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness, he says to the Corinthians. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you. Well, how is he jealous for them? Since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I'm afraid that as a serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Is Paul zealous? Getting those confused. Is he jealous? Yes, he's jealous. Is that approved of God? I think so. What's he jealous for? What does he want from the Corinthians? He says it in verse 3. A sincere and pure devotion to Christ. I don't want that to be affected. I don't want someone to come along and take you away from that state of your relationship. All right. Last one. Numbers chapter 25, going back to the Old Testament. This is where the children of Israel are encamped, and we find out, Balaam is defeated in his purposes. Well, Balak is defeated, who tries to get Balaam to prophesy against the Israelites, and every time Balaam prophesies, he blesses them. But then we find out in chapter 25 that the Moabites are actually kind of subverting things by entering into immoral relationships with the Israelites. And God is displeased. Verse 3 of Numbers 25, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And what did Phinehas do? It says down in verse 6, one of the Israelites brings a Midianite woman into the camp in the sight of everyone. Phinehas goes and gets a spear and puts it through the man and the woman. And it says down in verse 10, the Lord says to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. So interesting there. God is jealous for his people, and Phinehas acts in a jealous way toward God because of this disobedience on the part of one of these Israelites. So, I think what he's jealous of is that he wants Israel to act in purity as opposed to immorally. So, we've got 7 examples, kind of a mixed bag there. We've got some examples of what we think of as jealousy. Somebody becomes envious of what someone else has, and they do something evil in order to try to even things up. On the other hand, we've got some examples where someone is jealous and it's said to be a godly thing. Now let me just ask, we'll go through the rest of these questions, how could jealousy be godly? I mean, just from the standpoint, we usually think of it as something evil. Any thoughts about that? I mean, think of those examples where it was approved by God. Yeah, God is said to be jealous. What does God in his jealousy want? Okay. Okay. So he wants a relationship with those to whom he has offered it. Initially Israel, now to anyone, as far as the gospel is concerned. He wants to possess something, not in the selfish sense, but he wants to have this relationship with us through the gospel. He had a relationship with Israel in terms of the blessings that he gave to them. So if you think of it as what's the object about which one is jealous? Is it something rightful or is it something wrong? And I think that will help us kind of determine in cases, whether how we act and whether that action is right or not. So let's look at letter B, which I don't have here. Very quickly, a couple of passages that talk about a couple of relationships where God is said to be jealous. Okay, the first one is Deuteronomy 32, and I can't read all of this, but notice, what do you suspect God is jealous about? Look up in verse 16. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, okay, idols. With abominations they provoked him to anger. And so the Lord spurns them. The point I want to make is, let me just add verses 20 and 21. And then let me highlight. The relationship he describes here is like a father with his children. So, the point of this passage is to say, yes, God was jealous. Why is he jealous? It describes his relationship with Israel as a father and his children, sons and daughters. Well, what would be the rightful relationship between a parent and a child? Father, mother, and their children. Obedience, okay. What? Yeah, respect, okay. Really, a relationship, wouldn't it be? It's not just, okay, you obey me. It's you obey me because, you're my child and I'm your father. And there's a intimacy to that, all right? Now, look at the second passage, Ezekiel chapter 16. And again, this whole chapter is about this. But basically what it declares is that Israel has acted in an adulterous way. And so it's using this idea of a husband and wife. And we could read all of that. But the point is, you think of that relationship, husband and wife, okay? And someone being adulterous. So those are both relationships where God is described as being jealous of his people because they have disobeyed him. So let's go to letter C and say and ask the question, jealousy, is it harmful or helpful? Well, let's look at three passages that talk about some of the dangers of jealousy. Look at Proverbs chapter 6, verse 34. For jealousy makes a man furious, and he will not spare when he takes revenge. He will accept no compensation. He will refuse though you multiply gifts. And I think this is in the context of marriage here. So what's the problem with jealousy according to Proverbs 6:34? Yeah, okay. You get angry and you just can't control yourself. So it can certainly lead to that. I mean, we see it on the news all the time, domestic difficulties, and it often leads to just terrible things. All right, Proverbs 27:4, wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? How do I know jealousy is bad according to this? Yeah, jealousy is worse than wrath and anger, okay? So it's even worse than that, jealousy. So there's certainly that danger. Look at James chapter 3, 14 to 16. If you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, so that's interesting. Bitter jealousy and what? Selfish ambition. Okay, you're concerned for self. In your heart, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, what? You're going to have chaos. And you're going to have evil. Think of Joseph's brothers. What did they do, driven by their jealousy? All right, a third example, 1 Corinthians 12, and we'll look at this one quickly. This doesn't mention the word jealousy, but look at what Paul describes, members of the body, and he says, suppose the foot says, I'm not the hand, I don't belong to the body. Or the ear says, I'm not the eye, I don't belong to the body. So how is that jealousy? You know, here's some part of the body wishing that they were another part of the body. I don't have that honor. Well, he comes around and says in the later verses, this kind of attitude can cause division. And so that's another danger of jealousy. You can get all sorts of problems, a malfunctioning body. So are there dangers in jealousy? There certainly are. And we need to be aware of that. Let's look at, I think this is number 2, letter A. Is there such a thing as proper jealousy? Well, let's look at these passages. 1 Corinthians 7:4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So what's the thought there? Maybe think of that selfish ambition. What's marriage about? Is it about getting what's rightfully mine? No. It's about giving. And I think that's what Paul is emphasizing in this particular passage. Ephesians 5:28, I think he zeroes in on husbands and says, you need to love your wife as your own body. And then Song of Solomon 8:6, I think we'll recognize this one. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death. Jealousy is fierce as the grave. Well, it's this idea of, okay, you are mine. Not necessarily in a selfish way, I think, but saying we belong to each other. And so it's like a seal upon someone's heart or seal upon your arm. So I would say there, the spouse's jealousy for the faithfulness of the other. Is that a rightful jealousy? Okay, shouldn't have to come up. Okay. Yeah, so ideally it doesn't happen because each is caring for the other and concerned about the other. And that's the challenge, isn't it? So the ungodly jealousy shouldn't arise, especially if both are giving each other the proper attention. Okay, look at 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Is God jealous of our faithfulness to Him? Yeah, He wants us, everything we do, to glorify Him. Okay? So it's not this selfish possession, but it's this idea of that I want to be in this relationship with you, and I desire that. All right, last one here, Ephesians 1:14. This is the idea of possession. Paul writes and says, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it to the praise of His glory. So I think he's saying that God is desirous of those for whom salvation is a reality. From the beginning of time, He has desired salvation for those who love Him. And he's jealous of them. He's jealous of their devotion and faithfulness to Him. So, part of what we're trying to say here is there's a proper jealousy, which is a zeal for the right thing, for the things that God desires, but there's the wrong kind of zeal or jealousy, when we want something for ourselves, and especially if it's not rightfully ours. Okay? So that's helpful to determine, what's the nature of this jealousy. And I realize we don't tend to think of jealousy probably in that positive way. I don't think, but we've seen some examples of that. What are some other principles when we're talking about jealousy? Well, look at these statements made about God in his relationship with Israel. In the giving of the Ten Commandments, God says, I'm a jealous God. I visit iniquity, but what else do I do? Do I just continue to visit iniquity upon everyone forever? No. I show steadfast love to those who love me and keep my commandments. All right? So, jealousy involves love and kindness, the right kind of jealousy, the right kind of zeal. Evidences love and kindness. Ezekiel 16, we were in this passage a moment ago. Notice at the end of this section, he says, I'll be calm and will no more be angry. So the anger subsides. God is a forgiving God. And Joel 2:18 talks about pity. The Lord became zealous for his land and had pity on his people. So what we're saying is, what goes along with a godly jealousy is love and kindness, forgiveness, pity. Those are all qualities that God has demonstrated. We're out of time. This is the last passage we've got here. Yes, jealousy is condemned in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 3:3 says, for you are still of the flesh, for while there's jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh? And we all know that that's a list of the works of the flesh in Galatians 5:20. So when there is a carnal concern, things that we don't have a right to have, and that could be anything and everything, possessions, wealth, riches, some kind of relationship that's not right, that jealousy is wrong, and it's condemned in Scripture. Well, we'll stop there. And next time, lesson 6, I believe, is having to do with success. So we don't necessarily think of success as a real challenge, but we're going to look at some things that, some examples about that. All right.